The snowstorm that buried Rose Whitmore alive beneath 12 feet of white fury had first stolen her screams, then her voice, leaving her lungs burning and throat raw from crying out to a frozen world that refused to answer back. When Garrett Grayson found her 3 days after the blizzard had passed, clawing through the collapsed remains of a way station near Concord, New Hampshire, in January of 1876, she could only mouth the words "thank you" while tears froze on her cheeks. Garrett pulled her from the wreckage with hands that knew both gentleness and strength, his broad shoulders blocking the wind that still whipped across the barren landscape. He wrapped her in his coat without speaking, noting how she tried to form words but produced nothing except painful, rasping attempts that made her wince. Her dark hair hung in matted tangles around a face pale as the snow itself, and her green eyes held a wildness that came from staring death in the face and somehow surviving. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and steady as he lifted her onto his horse. "I've got a cabin 2 miles east. Can you hold on?" She nodded, her fingers gripping the saddle horn with determination that impressed him. Most people would have collapsed entirely after such an ordeal, but this woman had fight in her. He swung up behind her, keeping one arm around her waist to steady her as they rode through the knee-deep snow that had transformed the New Hampshire wilderness into an unforgiving white desert. The cabin appeared through the trees like a blessing, smoke curling from its stone chimney. Garrett had built it himself 5 years ago when he had come east from Montana, following a cattle drive that had ended badly and left him looking for a fresh start. New Hampshire was not cattle country, but it offered timber work and solitude, 2 things he had needed after watching his brother die in a stampede outside of Miles City. He carried Rose inside and set her near the fire, where the heat could begin thawing her frozen limbs. She trembled violently, her body finally reacting to the cold now that safety surrounded her. Garrett moved quickly, fetching blankets and heating water for tea laced with honey. He had learned frontier medicine from necessity, and he knew the signs of frostbite and exposure well enough to assess her condition. Her fingers and toes would survive, he determined, though they would pain her for weeks. The raw throat concerned him more. When he gestured for her to open her mouth, she obeyed, and he saw the angry redness that spoke of damage from screaming in sub-freezing temperatures. He had seen it once before, in a miner who had been trapped in a collapsed shaft during a Montana winter. That man had recovered his voice after 2 months, though it had never sounded quite the same. "You cannot talk," Garrett said, making it a statement rather than a question. "That is all right. You do not need to talk. Drink this slowly." Rose took the cup with shaking hands, and he noticed how she watched him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. She wore a traveling dress beneath her torn coat, suggesting she had been a passenger at the way station rather than staff. A small leather bag lay near where he had found her, containing a few pieces of clothing and a book of poetry by Emily Dickinson. No letters, no indication of where she had been going or why. That first night, communication happened through gestures and expressions. Rose tried several times to speak, frustration crossing her features each time only silence or painful croaking emerged. Garrett brought her a pencil and paper from his small desk, and she wrote in careful script, "Thank you for saving my life. I am Rose Whitmore from Boston. The stage was taking me to Concord when the storm hit." "Garrett Grayson," he replied. "Montana originally, but I have been in these parts for 5 years. What brings a Boston woman to Concord in the dead of winter?" She hesitated before writing. "A teaching position. The school sent for me 6 weeks ago. I was supposed to arrive before Christmas." Garrett nodded, understanding the disappointment in her eyes. "I will take you into Concord once the road's clear. Should be another week or so. You are welcome to stay here until then." The simple kindness in his words made her eyes well up, and she looked away quickly, as if ashamed of the emotion. Garrett pretended not to notice, busying himself with preparing a simple meal of salt pork and beans. He had never been comfortable with tears, even the grateful kind. Over the next few days, a routine developed between them. Garrett would rise before dawn, tend to his horse and the few chickens he kept, then prepare breakfast while Rose woke slowly by the fire. She remained weak, her body recovering from the ordeal, but each day brought a little more color to her cheeks and steadiness to her movements. They communicated through her written notes and his spoken responses, an odd conversation that somehow worked. Rose had a sharp wit that came through in her writing, and Garrett found himself looking forward to reading her observations about the cabin, the weather, or the stories he told her about his years in Montana. "You must have loved it there," she wrote one evening as they sat by the fire. "Your voice changes when you talk about the mountains." "I did love it," Garrett admitted, surprised by her perceptiveness. "But I loved my brother more, and when he died, the mountains just reminded me of what I had lost. Sometimes you have to leave the places you love to keep on living." Rose studied him for a long moment, then wrote, "I understand that better than you might think." She did not elaborate, and Garrett did not press. Everyone carried their own ghosts, especially those who traveled far from home in the middle of winter to start new lives among strangers. On the fourth day, Garrett woke to find Rose standing at the window, watching the sunrise paint the snow in shades of pink and gold. She had braided her hair, and she wore a clean dress from her bag, looking more like the schoolteacher she was meant to be than the half-frozen survivor he had pulled from the wreckage. "Beautiful, is it not?" he said, coming to stand beside her. She nodded, then turned to him and opened her mouth. A small sound emerged, barely more than a whisper, but it was there. Her eyes widened in surprise and hope. "Take it slow," Garrett cautioned. "Your throat is still healing. Do not push too hard." But Rose was already writing. "It is the first sound I have made in days. Do you think my voice will come back?" "I think you are stronger than any storm that tried to break you," Garrett replied. "Your voice will return when it is ready." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude or obligation. Rose felt it in the way Garrett looked at her, not with pity but with respect, and something else she could not quite name. Garrett felt it in the way his heart beat faster when she smiled, a rare expression that transformed her serious face into something luminous. The week passed more quickly than either of them wanted to acknowledge. The roads cleared, and Concord lay only a half-day's ride away. Garrett knew he should take Rose there, deliver her to the school that awaited her, and return to his solitary life in the cabin. But each evening he found excuses to delay. The road needed another day to fully thaw. The weather might turn again. She needed more time to recover her strength. Rose wrote less as her voice returned in fits and starts, emerging as a hoarse whisper that grew incrementally stronger each day. She practiced by reading aloud from her book of poetry, the words coming out rough and broken but unmistakably real. "Hope is the thing with feathers," she read one evening, her voice catching on every third word. "That perches in the soul, and sings the tune without the words, and never stops at all." Garrett listened from across the room where he cleaned his rifle, pretending the sound of her voice did not affect him. But it did. God help him, it did. He had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to share space with another person, to wake up to the smell of coffee someone else had made, to hear footsteps that were not his own crossing the wooden floor. "That is a good one," he said when she finished. "Your voice is getting stronger every day." "Thanks to you," Rose whispered. You saved me in more ways than one, Garrett Grayson." He looked up and found her watching him with an expression that made his breath catch. In that moment, he knew he was in trouble. He had spent 5 years building walls around his heart, convincing himself that solitude was safer than connection, that losing his brother had taught him the danger of loving anyone too much. But Rose Whitmore was slipping through those walls like water through cracks in stone, and he had no idea how to stop her. The next morning, Garrett announced they would leave for Concord after breakfast. Rose nodded, though her hand trembled slightly as she buttoned her coat. She had written him a long letter the night before, trying to express what his kindness had meant to her, but the words had seemed inadequate on paper. "How did you thank someone for giving you back your life?" The ride into town took longer than Garrett had estimated, the road still treacherous with ice beneath the melting snow. Rose rode behind him, her arms around his waist, and he tried not to think about how perfectly she fit against him, or how empty the cabin would feel when he returned to it alone. Concord appeared before them in the early afternoon. A proper New Hampshire town with white church steeples and brick buildings lining streets that had been carefully planned, rather than haphazardly thrown together like the western towns Garrett remembered. People moved about their business with purposeful efficiency, and he felt suddenly out of place in his worn buckskins and Montana hat. The school stood at the edge of town, a 2-story building painted cheerful yellow with green shutters. A woman in her 50s emerged as they approached, her face stern until she recognized Rose. "Miss Whitmore," she exclaimed. "We had given you up for dead when we heard about the way station. The storm was terrible. Where have you been, Mrs. Patterson?" Rose whispered, her voice still rough. "This is Garrett Grayson. He saved my life." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened as she looked at Garrett. "Then we owe you a debt we can never repay, Mr. Grayson. Please, both of you, come inside. Rose, you must be exhausted. We have your room ready, have had it ready since Christmas." Garrett helped Rose down from the horse, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. She looked up at him, and he saw his own reluctance mirrored in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "Take care of yourself, Rose Whitmore," he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. "Practice that voice. The students will need to hear you." He turned to leave, but her hand caught his sleeve. "Will you visit? Before you go back to your cabin?" The hope in her question nearly undid him. Garrett knew the smart thing would be to ride away now, cleanly, before this thing between them grew into something that could hurt them both. But when had he ever been smart about matters of the heart? "I will visit," he promised. "Tomorrow, Mrs." Patterson watched this exchange with knowing eyes, and when she led Rose inside, she said quietly, "He seems like a good man." "He is," Rose whispered. "He is the best man I have ever met." Her room was small but comfortable, with a bed covered in a wedding ring quilt and a window overlooking the street. Rose unpacked her few belongings and sat on the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by how much had changed in such a short time. 2 weeks ago, she had been running from Boston and a failed engagement to a man who had wanted to reshape her into something docile and decorative. The storm had nearly killed her, but it had also delivered her to Garrett, who looked at her like she was already exactly who she was meant to be. That night, she lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the town and missing the crackle of Garrett's fire, the solid comfort of his presence across the room. She had told herself she was coming west to teach, to start fresh, to prove she could build a life on her own terms. But now all she could think about was a cowboy with kind eyes who had taught her that silence could be its own language, and that some people were worth staying for. Garrett kept his promise and arrived the next afternoon, cleaned up and wearing his best shirt. Rose met him at the door, her smile bright enough to rival the winter sun reflecting off the snow. You came, she said, her voice still hoarse but stronger than yesterday. I said I would, Garrett replied. I always keep my word. They walked through town together, Rose showing him the school where she would teach, and the general store where Mrs. Patterson had helped her secure credit for necessities. People stared at the odd pair they made, the refined Boston schoolteacher and the rough frontiersman, but neither of them cared. Tell me about Montana, Rose said as they sat on a bench outside the church. Really tell me, not just the stories you shared at the cabin. So Garrett talked about the mountains that touched the sky, about roundups that lasted weeks and cattle drives that stretched across hundreds of miles. He told her about his brother Samuel, who had been 3 years younger and twice as reckless, who had made Garrett laugh like no one else could and whose death had carved a hole in the world that nothing had filled. You blame yourself, Rose observed quietly. I was supposed to watch out for him, Garrett said. That is what older brothers do. You cannot control a stampede any more than I could have controlled that blizzard, Rose said. Bad things happen, Garrett. We survive them if we are lucky, and we honor the people we lost by keeping on living. He looked at her, this woman who had lost her own voice to screaming in the cold and was finding it again one painful word at a time, and felt something inside him begin to heal. How did you get so wise? He asked. I am not wise, Rose whispered. I am just tired of running from things that scare me. What scares you? This, she said simply, gesturing between them. You scare me. How much I want to know you to understand you. I came here to be independent, to prove I did not need anyone. And then you pulled me from that rubble and took care of me, and I realized that needing someone is not the same as being weak. Garrett reached for her hand, his calloused palm warm against her cold fingers. You could never be weak, Rose Whitmore. You are the strongest person I have ever met. They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon light faded, both of them aware they were standing at a crossroads. Garrett could return to his cabin and his solitary life. Rose could throw herself into teaching and building the independent future she had envisioned. Or they could take the risk, step off the edge together and see where the fall might lead. I should head back before dark, Garrett said finally, though he made no move to stand. You could stay in town, Rose suggested. Mrs. Patterson mentioned the boarding house takes lodgers. And what would I do in town, Rose? I am a cowboy, a timberman, not a shopkeeper or a clerk. You could be whatever you wanted to be, she said. Is that not the promise of coming east, coming to new territory, the chance to become something different? Garrett wanted to argue, to point out all the logical reasons why he should not upend his life for a woman he had known barely 2 weeks. But the truth was, he had been half alive since Samuel died, going through motions without purpose. Rose made him want to be fully alive again, to take risks and build something that mattered. Let me think on it, he said. I will come back in a few days. Promise? Rose asked, and there was vulnerability in her eyes that made his chest tighten. Promise, he replied, sealing it with a squeeze of her hand. The ride back to the cabin felt longer than it ever had before. Garrett spent 3 days chopping wood, checking his trap lines and trying to convince himself he was content with his solitary existence. But the cabin echoed with emptiness, and he kept looking up, expecting to see Rose by the window or curled up reading by the fire. On the 4th day, he woke before dawn and made his decision. He packed his essential belongings, loaded his horse, and rode into Concord as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. Mrs. Patterson answered his knock at the school door, unsurprised to see him. She has been watching for you, the older woman said. Every day, standing at that window during her lunch break. Is she here now? In the classroom, preparing lessons. 3rd door on the left. Garrett found Rose bent over a slate, writing out arithmetic problems in careful script. She had not heard him enter, and he took a moment to simply watch her, memorizing the way sunlight caught in her dark hair and the small furrow of concentration between her brows. "Those students are lucky to have you," he said. Rose spun around, chalk falling from her fingers. Her face transformed with joy, and she crossed the room in 3 quick steps. "You came back." "I came back to stay," Garrett said. "If you will have me, I can find work here, make a life. I cannot promise it will be easy, and I know we are moving fast, but Rose, I have never been more certain of anything." She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her green eyes shining. "I will have you, Garrett Grayson, today, tomorrow, for as long as you want to stay." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long journey through wilderness. Her lips were soft against his, and she tasted like peppermint tea and possibility. They broke apart slowly, both of them slightly breathless. "I have to warn you," Rose whispered, her voice still carrying that husky rasp from her damaged throat. "I am not easy to live with. I have opinions about everything, and I read late into the night, and I sometimes burn breakfast because I get distracted by clouds or birds or the way light falls through windows." Garrett laughed, the sound rusty from disuse but genuine. "And I snore like a bear, and I track mud everywhere, and I have been known to spend entire days barely speaking because I get lost in my own thoughts. I think we will manage." Mrs. Patterson found them standing together, hands intertwined, and cleared her throat delicately. "Mr. Grayson, if you are serious about staying in Concord, I may be able to help. My brother-in-law owns the lumber mill outside town. They are always looking for men who know their way around timber and are not afraid of hard work." "I would be grateful for an introduction," Garrett said. "Consider it done. And Rose, dear, I think we should discuss finding you more permanent lodgings. A small house, perhaps, something with room for 2 if circumstances were to change." Rose blushed, understanding the implication, but her smile never wavered. "That would be wonderful, Mrs. Patterson." The next months passed in a blur of activity and quiet moments that built toward something substantial. Garrett proved himself at the lumber mill, his Montana strength and Western work ethic impressing even the hardest New Hampshire loggers. He found lodging at the boarding house, a small room that served its purpose while he saved money for something better. Rose began teaching, her damaged voice adding a unique quality to her lessons that the students found intriguing rather than off-putting. She had a gift for making arithmetic interesting and literature come alive, and within weeks, her classroom was the most popular in the school. Every evening, Garrett would finish at the mill and walk Rose home from school. They explored Concord together, learning its rhythms and secrets, finding their favorite spots to sit and talk. The river where ice broke up in early spring, sending chunks floating downstream like crystal ships. The hill behind the church where wildflowers would bloom come summer. The small restaurant run by a French couple who made bread that reminded Rose of Boston, and steaks that reminded Garrett of Montana. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and dreams. Rose told him about growing up in Boston society, about parents who had died when she was 19 and left her in the care of an aunt who saw her only as a commodity to be married off. About Jonathan Sterling, the banker her aunt had chosen for her, who had wanted a decorative wife to host his parties and had recoiled when Rose expressed opinions about suffrage and education reform. "I left 2 days before the wedding," Rose said one evening in April as they sat by the river. "Packed a bag and bought a train ticket and never looked back. My aunt probably still has not forgiven me. Her loss," Garrett said simply. "Any family who cannot see your worth does not deserve you." Rose leaned against his shoulder, comfortable in the silence that fell between them. Her voice had mostly recovered, though it retained a slightly husky quality that Garrett privately loved. It made her sound like she had lived, like she carried stories in her throat alongside her words. "What about you?" she asked. "Any family besides Samuel?" "Parents died of cholera when I was 16, Garrett said. "It was just me and Sam after that. We worked ranches all through Montana Territory, saved up to buy our own spread someday. That dream died with him." "Maybe it is time for a new dream," Rose suggested gently. Garrett looked down at her, at this woman who had survived being buried alive and emerged stronger, and felt his heart make a decision his head had already accepted weeks ago. "Rose Whitmore, I know we have not known each other long by conventional standards. But I also know I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. I want to build a home with you, raise a family if we are blessed with children, and grow old watching you teach generations of students. Will you marry me?" Rose sat up, her eyes searching his face. "You mean it?" "Truly, I have never meant anything more in my life," Garrett said. "Then yes," Rose said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you, Garrett Grayson." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, pouring 5 years of loneliness and 2 months of falling in love into the embrace. When they finally broke apart, both were laughing and crying at the same time. They married 6 weeks later, in May of 1876, in the same white church where they had sat and talked about Montana and Boston, and all the places they had been before finding each other. Mrs. Patterson stood as Rose's attendant, and the mill foreman stood for Garrett. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when Garrett slipped a gold band on Rose's finger, his hands were steady with certainty. Rose had worried her voice might fail her during the vows, but it rang clear and strong through the church. "I, Rose Whitmore, take you, Garrett Grayson, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part." Garrett's voice was equally strong. "I, Garrett Grayson, take you, Rose Whitmore, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part." The small gathering of townspeople who had come to witness the ceremony applauded when the reverend pronounced them husband and wife. Garrett kissed his bride thoroughly, earning good-natured laughter and a few whistles from the mill workers in attendance. Mrs. Patterson had helped them find a small house on the edge of town, a white clapboard structure with a garden plot and enough room for a growing family. Garrett had spent the previous month making repairs and improvements, wanting everything perfect for Rose. Now, as he carried her across the threshold, she laughed with pure joy at the sight of furniture he had built himself and curtains Mrs. Patterson had helped him hang. "It is perfect," Rose said, turning in his arms to kiss him. "You are perfect." "Far from it," Garrett replied. "But I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserve." That first night as husband and wife, they lay together in the bed Garrett had built from local oak, talking in whispers as moonlight spilled through the window. Rose traced the calluses on Garrett's hands, these marks of hard work and honest labor that had pulled her from the snow and built her a home. "Tell me something you have never told anyone else," she said. Garrett thought for a moment, then replied, "Sometimes I dream about Sam, and in the dreams he is alive and laughing, and I forget he is gone. Then I wake up and have to remember all over again. Those mornings are the hardest." Rose pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his heart. "Tell me about the good times with him. Not how he died, but how he lived." So Garrett talked late into the night about his brother who could make friends with wild horses, who sang off-key around campfires, who had believed the best of everyone he met. And in the telling, the memories became less painful, more like treasures to be cherished rather than wounds to be protected. "He would have liked you," Garrett said finally. "He always said I was too serious, that I needed someone to make me laugh." "I will make you laugh," Rose promised. "Every day, for as long as we both shall live." Rose continued teaching through that first summer, though she cut back her hours to help Garrett establish their home. Together they planted a garden, learning through trial and error what grew well in New Hampshire soil. They painted the house a soft blue, picked chickens from a neighboring farm, and adopted a dog that had been hanging around the mill looking for scraps. Garrett named the dog Sam, and Rose understood it was his way of keeping his brother close. The dog was a mutt of uncertain heritage, all gangly legs and enthusiasm, and it followed Garrett everywhere with slavish devotion. "I think he loves you more than I do," Rose teased one evening as Sam sprawled across Garrett's feet by the fireplace. "Impossible," Garrett replied, pulling her into his lap. "No one could love me more than you do, because no one has ever loved me as well." These quiet evenings became Rose's favorite times, when the work of the day was done and they could simply exist together. Sometimes they read aloud to each other, Rose favoring poetry while Garrett preferred adventure stories. Sometimes they played cards or chess. Often they just talked, learning each other's minds and hearts with the dedication they had brought to learning each other's bodies. By autumn, Rose discovered she was pregnant. She told Garrett one October evening when the leaves had turned to flame and the air carried the first hint of coming winter. He responded by sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around until she was dizzy with laughter. "We are having a baby," he kept repeating, wonder in his voice. "Rose, we are having a baby." "I know," she said, happy tears streaming down her face. "I know, my love." Garrett became almost comically protective during the pregnancy, insisting Rose rest constantly and worry about nothing. She tolerated his fussing because she understood. It came from love and perhaps a little fear of losing someone else he cared about. But she also continued teaching until she grew too large to comfortably stand at the chalkboard. And she continued maintaining their home because she refused to be treated like an invalid. "I survived being buried alive in a blizzard," she reminded Garrett one evening when he tried to stop her from hanging laundry. "I think I can handle some wet sheets." "Humor me," he replied, taking the basket from her hands. "I need to feel useful." "You are useful," Rose said, resting her hand on her swollen belly. "You are building our family. You are loving me. That is the most useful thing anyone has ever done." Their son was born on a snowy February night in 1877, almost exactly a year after Garrett had pulled Rose from the rubble. Labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Garrett, pacing outside the bedroom door while the midwife attended Rose, thought he might lose his mind from helplessness. But when he finally heard the baby's first cry, followed by Rose's exhausted laugh, he knew everything would be all right. The midwife emerged with a squalling bundle and placed the baby in Garrett's arms. "You have a son, Mr. Grayson. A healthy, loud son, and your wife is asking for you." Garrett entered the bedroom to find Rose propped against pillows, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale but radiant. He sat beside her, carefully transferring their son into her arms. "He is perfect," Rose whispered, studying the tiny face with wonder. "Look at him, Garrett. We made this perfect little person." "What should we name him?" Garrett asked, unable to take his eyes off his wife and child. Rose looked up at him, understanding in her eyes. "Samuel. We should name him Samuel after the brother who would have loved him." Garrett felt tears sting his eyes, the good kind that came from joy rather than grief. "Samuel Grayson. It suits him." Young Samuel grew quickly, a sturdy child with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. He was walking by 10 months, talking in full sentences by 2 years, and getting into mischief from the moment he learned to climb. Rose often joked that he had inherited the recklessness of his namesake uncle, and Garrett could only agree as he rescued the boy from trees, fences, and one memorable incident involving the neighbor's goat. Rose returned to teaching part-time when Samuel was 3, bringing him with her to the classroom where he sat quietly in the corner, already learning his letters and numbers by osmosis. Garrett had been promoted to foreman at the mill, his fairness and skill earning him the respect of workers and owners alike. They saved carefully, adding to their home and their savings with an eye toward the future. In the spring of 1880, their daughter arrived, a delicate child they named Grace. She was quieter than her brother, content to observe the world with serious gray eyes that reminded Garrett of his mother. Samuel adored his baby sister, appointing himself her protector and dragging his wooden horse to her cradle so she would have something interesting to look at. "We are blessed," Rose said one evening as she nursed Grace while Garrett read to Samuel from a book of fairy tales. "I never imagined I could be this happy." "Neither did I," Garrett admitted. "There were years I thought I would spend my whole life alone, that I had used up my share of happiness, and all that remained was getting through each day. Then a blizzard brought me you." "The winter took my voice from screaming in the cold," Rose said softly, looking up from their daughter. "But it brought me to you, and you learned to hear my heart." Garrett set the book aside and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside the rocking chair. "I heard your heart from the moment I found you. It was beating so strong, so determined to survive." "How could I not love someone with a heart like that?" Samuel, impatient with the adult conversation interrupting his story, tugged on Garrett's sleeve. "Papa, you did not finish about the dragon." "Right," Garrett said, ruffling his son's hair. "Cannot leave the night hanging, can we?" The years flowed past like the river through Concord, marked by small joys and occasional sorrows. Rose's aunt from Boston appeared unexpectedly when Samuel was 5, having somehow tracked down her wayward niece. The visit was tense at first, the older woman clearly prepared to disapprove of everything she found. But watching Rose with her children, seeing the love between her and Garrett, something in the aunt softened. "I was wrong about you," she admitted on the last day of her visit. "I thought you needed a man like Jonathan Sterling to give you security and position. I did not understand you needed someone who would let you be yourself." "I forgive you," Rose said simply, "and I hope you will come visit again, meet your family." The aunt did return, nearly every summer, bringing gifts for the children and grudging respect for Garrett. She even admitted, after several glasses of wine one evening, that she envied Rose for having the courage to choose love over convenience. Garrett's past came calling in 1883, when a cowboy from Montana wandered into the mill looking for work and recognized Garrett immediately. Over drinks at the local saloon, the man caught Garrett up on all the news from his old territory. The ranch where he and Samuel had worked had been sold to a cattle baron from Texas. Most of the men they had known had scattered to other territories or settled down. Montana was changing, becoming more civilized with every passing year. "You ever miss it?" the cowboy asked. "The open range, the freedom?" Garrett considered the question honestly. "Sometimes I miss the mountains, but I do not miss the loneliness, and I do not miss the man I was before I came here. This is my home now. These are my people." The cowboy nodded, understanding in his weathered face. "You found your place. That is more than most of us can say." That conversation stayed with Garrett for days afterward, making him reflective. Rose noticed his thoughtful mood and finally asked about it one evening after the children were in bed. "Just thinking about roads not taken," Garrett said. If the storm had not hit that way station, if I had been somewhere else when you needed help, our whole lives would be different. But the storm did hit, and you were exactly where you needed to be, Rose replied. I do not believe in fate exactly, but I believe we find the people we are meant to find. You and I were meant to find each other. How can you be sure? Because we fit, Rose said simply. Like two pieces of a puzzle that were cut to go together. Even our broken parts match up and make something whole. Young Samuel grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books as much as his mother and horses as much as his father. Grace was quieter but no less determined, showing an early aptitude for drawing that had Rose saving every scrap of paper for her daughter's creations. In 1885, they welcomed another son, Thomas, who had Garrett's easy temperament and Rose's quick mind. The house expanded to accommodate their growing family, Garrett adding rooms with the carpentry skills he had honed over the years. What had started as a simple cottage became a proper home, filled with laughter and arguments and the comfortable chaos of family life. Rose eventually became the head mistress of the school, her reputation as an educator spreading throughout New Hampshire. Parents requested her specifically for their difficult students, knowing she had a gift for reaching children others had given up on. Her voice, which had returned with that distinctive husky quality, became one of the most recognized in Concord. Garrett rose to part owner of the lumber mill, his years of hard work and honest dealing earning him a stake in the business. He hired fairly, paid well, and built a reputation for quality that brought contracts from as far away as Boston and New York. The frontier skills he had learned in Montana served him well in New Hampshire, proving that hard work and integrity were valuable anywhere. On their 10th wedding anniversary in May 1886, Garrett surprised Rose with a trip to the cabin where they had first spent time together. He had maintained it over the years, visiting occasionally to check on the property and keep it in good repair. Now he wanted to share it with Rose again, to close a circle that had begun there. They left the children with Mrs. Patterson, who remained a close family friend despite her advancing years, and rode out on a spring morning bright with promise. The cabin looked exactly as Rose remembered it, down to the quilt on the bed and the wooden chair where Garrett had sat cleaning his rifle while she read poetry aloud. I was so frightened then, Rose said, standing in the middle of the room. Not of you, but of how much I wanted to stay. I had convinced myself that independence meant being alone, that needing someone made me weak. What changed your mind? Garrett asked, coming to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist. You did, Rose said, leaning back against him. You showed me that strength and love are not opposites, that the bravest thing we can do is let ourselves be vulnerable with someone who has earned our trust. They spent 3 days at the cabin, recapturing the quiet intimacy of those early weeks. They talked about their children's futures, about whether Samuel would want to work at the mill or go to university, whether Grace's artistic talent should be formally trained, what young Thomas might become. They made love with the passion of new lovers and the comfort of old friends, and they simply existed together, without the demands of work and family pulling them in different directions. On the last evening, sitting by the fire as they had 10 years earlier, Rose said, I want to tell you something I have never told anyone. I am listening, Garrett replied, taking her hand. When I was trapped under that rubble before you found me, I had stopped screaming. I had accepted I was going to die. And I remember thinking that I had wasted my whole life being afraid, running from my aunt and Jonathan, and every expectation anyone had ever placed on me. I thought I was running towards something, but really I was just running. And I made peace with dying because at least I would not have to be afraid anymore. Rose paused, wiping away tears. Then you pulled me out and I was so angry at first. Angry that I had to keep fighting, keep surviving. But you looked at me like I mattered, like my survival was important, and I realized I had been given another chance. Not to run, but to stand still and build something real. Thank you for standing still with me, Garrett said, pulling her close. Thank you for building this life we have. Thank you for teaching me I was worth saving, Rose replied. They returned to Concord renewed, ready to face whatever the future held together. The children greeted them with enthusiasm, Samuel full of stories about helping Mrs. Patterson in her garden, Grace proudly displaying the drawings she had completed, and Thomas simply happy to be cuddled by his parents again. Life continued its steady rhythm through the late 1880s and into the 1890s. Samuel grew into a young man of 18 by 1893, tall and serious, planning to study law at Dartmouth College. Grace at 13 showed increasing promise as an artist, her sketches of Concord life both technically skilled and emotionally resonant. Thomas at 8 was the wild child, always climbing something or exploring somewhere, reminding Garrett daily of his reckless brother. Rose turned 40 in 1891, Garrett 43, and they celebrated with a party that seemed to include half of Concord. Their home had become a gathering place over the years, known for welcoming everyone from mill workers to society ladies, from struggling students to successful merchants. Rose's philosophy was simple. Anyone who came to their door with respect would find a seat at their table. "You have built something remarkable here," Mrs. Patterson told Rose at the party, the old woman now well into her 70s but still sharp as a tack. "Not just a family, but a community. People look to you and Garrett as examples of what marriage should be." "We are just two people who got lucky," Rose demurred. "Luck had nothing to do with it," Mrs. Patterson replied. "You both chose each other every single day. That is not luck. That is commitment." The turn of the century in 1900 brought reflection and celebration. Garrett was 52, Rose 50, and they had been married 24 years. Samuel had graduated from Dartmouth and was clerking at a law firm in Boston, though he came home often. Grace, at 20, was studying at an art institute in New York City, her talent recognized by teachers who predicted great things for her. Thomas at 15 was already working part-time at the mill, showing his father's aptitude for the timber business. "Can you believe we have raised 3 children to adulthood?" Rose asked one evening as she and Garrett sat on their porch, watching fireflies dance in the summer twilight. "I can barely believe we have been married nearly a quarter century," Garrett replied. "It feels like yesterday I pulled you from that rubble." "The best thing that ever happened to me was that blizzard," Rose said. "The best thing that ever happened to me was being in the right place to find you," Garrett countered. They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the world they had built together. The house where their children had grown up. The garden Rose tended with the same care she brought to teaching. The town where they had become pillars of the community, respected and loved by neighbors who had watched their love story unfold over decades. "You remember when you asked me to marry you," Rose said. "You said you wanted to wake up next to me every morning for the rest of your life." "I remember," Garrett said. "Best decision I ever made." "I wake up grateful every single morning," Rose said. "Grateful the storm brought me to you. Grateful my voice came back so I could tell you I love you. Grateful for every day we have had and every day we still have ahead." "Your voice," Garrett said thoughtfully. "It still carries that rasp from the cold. Did you know that is when I fell in love with you? When you started getting your voice back and you read that Emily Dickinson poem, all broken and rough, but so determined." "I thought you fell in love with me when I burned your breakfast," Rose teased. "That too," Garrett admitted with a laugh. "But mostly it was your voice. The winter tried to take it from you, but you fought to get it back. That is when I knew you were the strongest person I had ever met." Thomas appeared from around the corner of the house, grass-stained and grinning. "Papa, Mr. Henderson says there is a big order coming in from Portland, and he wants to know if you can supervise." "Tell him I will be there first thing tomorrow," Garrett said, then added, "and go wash up for supper." Thomas ran off, all gangly teenage energy, and Rose smiled. "He is so much like how you described Samuel, your brother, I mean." "I know," Garrett said. "Sometimes it is like having Sam back, in the best possible way. A second chance to watch someone I love grow up wild and free." In 1902, Samuel married a lawyer he had met in Boston, a suffragette named Catherine who reminded Rose strongly of her younger self. The wedding was in Concord, with the whole town turning out to celebrate. Watching her son pledge his life to the woman he loved, Rose gripped Garrett's hand and thought about how far they had all come. Grace returned from New York for the wedding with news of her own. A gallery was interested in showing her work, a series of drawings depicting life in small-town New Hampshire. "I want to call the collection home," she told her parents. "Everything I draw, I am really drawing you. The love you showed me, the stability you gave me. That is what makes my art mean something." "We are so proud of you," Rose said, embracing her daughter. "So proud of all of you." Thomas, now 17, was courting the daughter of the Baptist minister, a bright girl named Helen who could argue theology and laugh at his jokes in equal measure. Watching him walk her home from church, Garrett saw himself and Rose in their early days, that heady mix of attraction and genuine friendship that formed the best foundations. "Think he will marry her?" Rose asked, watching from the window. "If he has any sense," Garrett replied. "She is perfect for him." The years between 1902 and 1910 brought grandchildren, 4 in total, 2 from Samuel and Catherine, 1 from Thomas and Helen who married in 1904, and a surprise late-in-life baby from Grace and the painter she married in 1906. Rose and Garrett's house, already expanded multiple times, gained yet another room to accommodate visiting family. "We need a bigger table," Rose declared after a particularly chaotic Sunday dinner where adults and children were practically sitting in each other's laps. Garrett built her one, a massive oak creation that could seat 14 comfortably. Family dinners became weekly traditions, the house filled with multiple generations talking over each other, babies crying, children laughing, the beautiful chaos of a family that had grown from 2 broken people who found each other in the aftermath of a blizzard. Rose retired from teaching in 1911 at age 60, her voice finally starting to show real signs of wear after decades of classroom use. The school held a ceremony in her honor, former students coming from across New England to pay tribute to the teacher who had changed their lives. The mayor of Concord gave a speech about her contributions to education. Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter, who now ran the school, presented Rose with a bound collection of letters from students spanning 3 decades. "You gave me my voice back," one letter read. "I was so shy I could barely speak in class, but you made me feel safe enough to try. You taught me that being smart was not something to hide," another said, "that my mind was a gift, not a curse." Letter after letter spoke of Rose's impact, her kindness, her high standards matched with unfailing support. Garrett sat in the audience watching his wife accept the accolades with characteristic grace, and his heart swelled with pride for this woman who had transformed so many lives simply by seeing people's potential and believing in them. In his speech at the ceremony, Garrett said, "My wife lost her voice once in a winter storm that nearly took her life, but she fought to get it back, and once she did, she used it to lift up everyone around her. She taught thousands of children. She built a community. She showed me what love really means. Rose Whitmore Grayson is the finest person I have ever known, and I thank God every day that a blizzard brought her into my life. Rose stood and kissed him in front of the entire assembly, not caring about propriety or what anyone thought. After 35 years of marriage, she had earned the right to kiss her husband whenever she pleased. Garrett retired from the mill in 1912, passing his ownership stake to Thomas, who had proven himself more than capable of running the business. At 64, Garrett was ready to slow down, to spend his days maintaining the house, tending the garden, and spoiling his grandchildren. He took up woodworking as a hobby, creating beautiful furniture that became prized throughout Concord. Rose and Garrett's later years were peaceful, filled with simple pleasures. They took walks along the river where he had proposed. They read to each other in the evenings as they always had. They watched their children raise families and their grandchildren grow. They attended church on Sundays and hosted dinners that lasted for hours. In 1916, on their 40th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration that spanned 3 days. Samuel came from Boston with his family. Grace traveled from New York, where her art career had flourished beyond anyone's expectations. Thomas and Helen, who lived just down the street, brought their 4 children. Grandchildren ranged from the eldest at 13 to the youngest at 2, and the house rang with noise and laughter. On the evening of their actual anniversary, after the party had wound down and the guests had gone home, Rose and Garrett sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. The stars were bright overhead, and the spring air carried the scent of lilacs from the garden. 40 years, Rose said wonderingly. Garrett, we have been married 40 years. Best 40 years of my life, Garrett replied. Though I am partial to year 1 when Samuel was born, and year 5 when Grace arrived, and year 9 when Thomas came along, and year 20 when Samuel graduated, and year 30 when we became grandparents. Actually, I am partial to all of them. Rose laughed, the sound still carrying that distinctive rasp that had never fully disappeared. I love you, Garrett Grayson. I have loved you since you pulled me from the snow. I will love you until the day I die, and probably beyond that too. I love you, Rose, Garrett said. You saved me just as much as I saved you. I was frozen in grief when we met, and you thawed my heart. You taught me to live again. They sat holding hands as the night deepened around them. 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds and built a life that had touched countless others. The winter had taken Rose's voice from screaming in the cold, but Garrett had learned to hear her heart, and in that hearing, they had created something beautiful and lasting. As they finally went inside, Rose paused in the doorway and looked back at the town sleeping peacefully under the stars. Concord, New Hampshire, had become home in ways Boston never had. This was where she had learned what love really meant. This was where she had raised her children and taught her students and built a life with a man who saw her as she truly was and loved her for it. What are you thinking? Garrett asked, his hand warm on her back. That I am grateful, Rose said, for the storm that brought me here, for you finding me. For every moment of the last 40 years, I would not change a single thing. Neither would I, Garrett agreed. Come to bed, my love. We have tomorrow to look forward to, and the day after that, and as many days as God grants us. They climbed the stairs to the bedroom they had shared for 4 decades, their steps slower than they once were but no less certain. And as they fell asleep in each other's arms, as they had done nearly 15,000 times before, both were content with the knowledge that they had found their home, their purpose, and their greatest love in each other. The years that followed brought the changes that time always brings. Garrett's hair turned completely white. Rose's vision dimmed, requiring spectacles for reading. But their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened with every passing season, every shared memory, every crisis weathered together. In 1920, Rose turned 69 and Garrett 72. Their children threw them a party for their 44th anniversary, and looking around at the faces gathered in their home, at children and grandchildren, and even the first great-grandchild born just that spring, Rose felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Speech. Thomas called out, and the call was taken up by others until Rose had no choice but to stand. Her voice, though weakened by age and that long-ago winter, still carried authority when she spoke. When I was 25 years old, I got on a train running from everything I knew. I thought I was coming to Concord to teach, to prove I could make it on my own, but really I was coming here to find this. She gestured around the room. This family, this love, this life. A blizzard tried to kill me, took my voice from screaming in the cold. But a cowboy from Montana pulled me from the rubble and taught himself to hear my heart. Everything good in my life came from that moment. So I want to thank you, Garrett Grayson, for saving me in every way a person can be saved. There was not a dry eye in the room when she finished. Garrett stood and pulled her into his arms, and their children started applauding, the grandchildren joining in, even though the youngest did not fully understand what they were celebrating. Later that night, in the quiet of their bedroom, Garrett said, "You know what I remember most about that day I found you?" "What?" Rose asked. "Your eyes," Garrett said. "Even half frozen and terrified, your eyes were fierce. They told me you were not done fighting. And I thought, whoever this woman is, she deserves someone who will fight for her too. So that is what I have tried to do every day since. Fight for you, fight for us, fight for this life we built." "You have fought so well," Rose said, tears streaming down her lined face. "You have loved me so well. I am the luckiest woman who ever lived." "I am the lucky one," Garrett insisted. "You made me believe in second chances. You gave me a family again after I lost Sam. You made me want to be better, do better, love better." They held each other as they had done countless times over 44 years, two people who had found completion in each other. The winter that had nearly killed Rose had instead delivered her to the love of her life. And Garrett, frozen in grief and loneliness, had found warmth and purpose in the fierce green eyes of a woman who refused to surrender to the cold. The final years of their story unfolded with the gentle grace of a well-loved book reaching its conclusion. In 1924, at age 76, Garrett's heart began to fail. The doctor told Rose to prepare for the worst, but Garrett rallied, determined to see one more spring, one more anniversary, one more smile from his beloved wife. He made it to their 48th anniversary in May 1924, surrounded by family who had gathered when word spread that Garrett was failing. On the morning of their anniversary, he woke before dawn and found Rose already awake beside him, watching him with eyes that still held the fierce determination he had fallen in love with. "Good morning, my love," Garrett whispered. "Good morning," Rose replied. "Happy anniversary." 48 years, Garrett said. "Not enough. 1,000 years would not be enough." "Then we will find each other in the next life," Rose said, taking his hand, "and the one after that, and we will keep finding each other forever." Garrett smiled, the expression peaceful. "I like that idea. You and me, finding each other across eternity." "Promise me something," Rose said, tears streaming down her face. "Anything. When you see Samuel, your brother, tell him thank you for me. Thank him for being reckless enough to bring you to Montana, for making you into the man who would one day save me from a snowstorm." "I will tell him," Garrett promised. "And Rose, when your time comes, whenever that is, I will be waiting. I will always wait for you." He died that evening peacefully, with Rose holding his hand and their children gathered around the bed. His last words were, "I love you, Rose Whitmore. Best thing that ever happened to me was the day winter brought you to my door." Rose lived another 6 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in March of 1930 at the age of 79. In those years without Garrett, she remained active in the community, spending time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, writing her memoirs so the family would always know their story. But everyone who knew her said a part of Rose had gone with Garrett, that she was simply waiting patiently to be reunited with the man who had learned to hear her heart. On her gravestone, placed next to Garrett's in the Concord Cemetery, her children inscribed the words she had requested. "The winter took my voice, but he taught me to sing again." And there, under the New Hampshire sky where snow fell soft in winter and flowers bloomed bright in spring, two people who had found each other against impossible odds rested together. Their love story had touched everyone who knew them, had created a family that would carry their legacy forward through generations. They had proven that sometimes the worst storms in life deliver us to exactly where we need to be, and that learning to hear someone's heart is the greatest gift love can give. Their house remained in the family for decades, eventually becoming a historical site that tourists visited to learn about Concord's history. The guide would tell the story of Rose and Garrett, how a Boston schoolteacher and a Montana cowboy had built one of the great love stories of their generation. Young couples would stand in the room where Garrett had first cared for Rose, imagining what it must have been like when she could not speak, and he had learned to understand her anyway. The furniture Garrett had built remained in use, passed down through the family, treasures that connected each generation to the man who had crafted them with such care. Grace's drawings of her parents hung in museums, her artistic eye having captured the love between them in ways words never could. Samuel's descendants became judges and lawyers, carrying forward his commitment to justice. Thomas's descendants continued running the lumber mill that bore the Grayson name, maintaining the standards of fairness and quality Garrett had established. But more than things or accomplishments, what endured was the story itself. Parents told their children about Rose and Garrett, about how true love could be found in the most unexpected circumstances, about how strength came from vulnerability, and how the willingness to be saved was as important as the willingness to save. The story of the winter that took a woman's voice and the cowboy who learned to hear her heart became legend in Concord, a reminder that some bonds transcend all obstacles. And on winter nights when snow fell heavy and cold, people would sometimes pause and remember Rose Whitmore screaming in the blizzard, her voice torn from her throat by the freezing wind. They would remember Garrett Grayson pulling her from the rubble and dedicating his life to making sure she never felt alone again. They would remember that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and that love, real love, is worth any risk, any challenge, any fear. In the end, their story was simple but profound. Two broken people had found each other and created something whole. A winter storm had nearly destroyed Rose, but it had delivered her to the person who would help her become who she was always meant to be. And Garrett, lost in grief and loneliness, had found purpose and joy in learning the language of Rose's heart. It was a love story for the ages, told and retold across generations. And the lesson it carried was one that never grew old. That sometimes we have to lose our voices to learn what really needs to be said. And sometimes the best thing we can do is learn to listen with more than our ears. Garrett and Rose had understood this truth and lived it every day of their 48 years together. They had shown that real love is not about grand gestures or perfect moments, but about choosing each other daily, about learning each other deeply, about building a life together, one conversation, one meal, one shared sunset at a time. Their descendants carried this wisdom forward, each generation learning from the example Rose and Garrett had set. And in Concord, New Hampshire, where their story had unfolded, people still spoke of them with reverence and warmth. The schoolteacher from Boston and the cowboy from Montana who had proven that love could overcome anything, even the coldest winter, even the deepest silence, even death itself. For in the hearts of everyone who knew them or heard their story, Rose and Garrett lived on, forever young, forever in love, forever proof that some bonds are strong enough to echo through eternity.